Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about the new State of the Cloud report. This report has been coming out for years and years. It's a real detailed portrait of what's going on with cloud computing today. To discuss that, I'm joined by Brian Adler, Senior Director, Cloud Market Strategy at Flexera, and a former Gartner analyst. Brian, hello to you. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be back here talking to you again this year.
So I know that this new cloud report that came out just in early March. Here we are in late March, which really is basically a brand new data. This report has been going on for years, like a dozen years. Tell me, give me a little background of the report itself, please.
Sure thing. Yeah, you're exactly right. This is the 12th year of the report. It actually started back in the day as the RightScale State of the Cloud report, and I was at RightScale at that time. So I actually went from RightScale to Gartner, as you mentioned, and then back over to Flexera, boomeranger as they call me, because
Cool.
Flexera acquired RightScale in 2018. So anybody who might be familiar with the RightScale State of the Cloud report, it shifted ownership or whatever you want to call it in the 2019 version, but it's the same report with the same basic questions, the same data sets, that kind of stuff since 2012, whenever we started it. Yeah.
So really over the decade plus the report has been running, it's a real historical document about the evolution of cloud computing, kind of in real time, so to speak. So if someone were to really sift back through those years, they would really get a sense of this is how cloud has grown up and sort of changed our world.
Very much so, and what we've done over the years, and we kind of keep it as a static report in some regards and a dynamic report in others. And static in that we ask the same questions to look for the trends, right? We ask kind of the same set of core questions year over year so we can identify those trends. And then we also ask dynamic questions, things about new technologies, and as the industry evolves, we ask things in accordance with that. And actually 2 years ago, on the 10th anniversary of it, I actually wrote a blog post where I did exactly what you said. I went back and collected all the previous ones, sifted through them, and tried to kind of pick out the bits and pieces and see where these trends became real things. And it was interesting to see that as you look at things that people are, as you might expect, experimenting with, then they eventually either become a thing or they drop off entirely. And it's been very, very true over the last decade.
Well, I've got a number of key points I'd like to go through with this year's report, but I'd like to get your sense. What's one big takeaway or a couple of key points you definitely want to make sure you get said about a report? What really stuck out this year as really significant?
Sure. And sort of the first one, and the one that we're kind of calling the headline, and a lot of folks have kind of attached onto, is that one of the static aspects that I mentioned, we ask every year, what are your top challenges with cloud, right? We will kind of get a feeling, what is it that you're not initially struggling with, but what are the challenges? What are the things that you have to make sure you're always keeping your eye on the ball? And year over year, security is the top of the list, right? Security should always be a concern. It always should be.
Sure.
This year, managing cloud spend, for the first time ever, managing cloud spend is actually overtaken security. Now, just barely, but it's still indicative of this. Okay, folks are getting more and more, we believe, more and more comfortable with the security of the cloud. 10 years ago, your chief security officers, I used to call them the arms cross guys. I'm not doing this cloud thing, no way,
Right.
And now that's evolved and they become more comfortable with it. The cloud providers have added, PCI and HIPAA compliance and FedRAMP and FISMA, all these little check boxes that these folks needed to feel comfortable. And they're now getting more comfortable. So as we're getting more and more workloads in the cloud, we're realizing that we're spending a lot in the cloud, and we're probably not spending it efficiently in the cloud. And therefore, managing cloud spend has become that top challenge this year.
It makes perfect sense when you think about it. I mean, I think that cloud was originally sold way back when as, hey, this is going to be, renting your infrastructure as opposed to buying it. It's going to be cheaper for you. But I think cloud has never really been about cost savings. It's about having a tool that's more powerful, more agile, more scalable. It actually may be more expensive. It's a better tool, but it's not necessarily a cheaper tool.
I would agree, right? And it's really been about innovation, right? The cloud value prop is all about the ability to innovate quickly and try things that you normally wouldn't have been able to try. Hey, boss, I need 100 servers for a week. Well, no, you don't have those. Well, in the cloud, yes, you can do that, right? So you're going to go ahead and be able to innovate and try things that you normally wouldn't have tried. Now, back as you mentioned, when I was at Gartner, I had this discussion with folks a lot. They'd say, hey to me, hey, Brian, is cloud cheaper? And I'd say, well, generally, but it takes time. You're not going to do it right the first time, right? There's the data center way and there's the cloud way, and they're not the same thing. You have these behaviors in the data center that weren't wrong. For example, leaving stuff running over the weekend, a dev and test workload running all weekend, right? There's no point in turning it off. The physical infrastructure is still going to run. The guy is still going to sweep the building. The security guy is still going to walk around. There's no changes in those costs. Well, if I go to the cloud and I leave it running, I'm paying for it. So a behavior that was fine over here is not fine over here. And as a result, the costs go up. So over time, you learn these things and you put processes in place and you'll see those costs go down. So the answer usually was, yes, cloud can be cheaper, but it's not going to be cheaper initially. So if that's your main motivation, saving money today, you're probably not going to have a good time.
So, all right, some key points from the report that Flexera laid out. One is there's a slight trend towards
Yeah.
single public cloud use. What's going on with that?
That one is interesting. Now, it's only slight at this point, but it's something we do want to keep an eye on, is that we're seeing for the first time the use of a single public cloud by our respondents is going up, and at the same time, the multi-cloud aspect is going down. And those are obviously very related, if you will. And I think what's going on here, and this is one of the things we're going to keep an eye on from a trend perspective, but what I think is going on here is that the cloud providers, the lowest common denominator stuff, compute, network, storage, those types of things, that has become almost a commodity at this point. And the race to the bottom in pricing is done, and they really can't differentiate on price that much. So they're differentiating on services, database services, AI/ML toolkit, caching services, all that kind of stuff. And as organizations are starting to use those, they're realizing, well, shoot, I don't need to be a DBA anymore. I can offload the database administration to this managed service. I don't need to write my own queuing server. I can go ahead and use this service. And they're realizing that those keep freeing up chunks of time for them to focus on their core competency. And if I learn the tool set of a single provider and they say, oh, anytime you need a NoSQL database, use this thing. Anytime you need a load balancer, use this thing. Frees up that time for them to focus on their core competency. And if they focus in a single cloud and learn just those tools, because all the cloud providers have tools to do the same thing, but they're all different.
Right.
And I don't have to learn those different tools. I can focus on this one thing and have these building blocks, and it frees up more time for me to be more work on my product roadmap, work on the stuff on my backlog, innovate, those kinds of things. So I really think that that's sort of the motivation that we're seeing folks tend to focus more on a single provider at this point.
Is there one among the big 3 to 4 or 5 big mega hyperscalers that is benefiting from that trend?
Yes and no. I mean, there's two, right? And that's another trend that we're seeing in the report year over year. Is back in the day, right? It was the Henry Ford thing. You'd have any cloud you want as long as it's AWS, right?
Right,
That was
right.
your option, right?
I remember.
Obviously, the other providers have come in. Azure has made huge gains, particularly, and this is where I'm going, particularly in the enterprise space.
Uh-huh.
Last year was the first year in the report where we saw Azure adoption actually exceed that of AWS. Now they flipped back this year by just a percentage or two. But if you break it down by enterprise, which we identify as companies with 1,000 employees or more, you'll see much more of the enterprises adopting Azure than they are AWS, and vice versa on the SMB side. So we're seeing many more SMBs gravitate towards AWS. And we're assuming, and we're going to ask more questions, we're finding ways to ask these questions to kind of delve into this, but most likely the enterprises have an agreement with Microsoft, right? They have an enterprise agreement, they have existing Microsoft infrastructure, they've got a sales guy who has their ear, all these kinds of things that make that the path of least resistance, and therefore the enterprises tend to gravitate towards Azure. So those are the two big ones. We definitely see Azure and AWS kind of that neck and neck at the top. From an all respondents perspective, Azure is slightly leading the enterprise, and then the other three, Google slightly behind that, and then the other providers down below those.
Here's a really interesting point from the report. You talk about the recent global economic uncertainty, whether it's Ukraine, recession, layoffs, has surprisingly had little to no effect on cloud usage and spend. So this year, 90% of respondents said their usage spend on cloud would remain the same. So in other words, it's cloud has become so important, it's not really the first on the chopping block.
Yeah, and actually, just to delineate that a little bit better, so 90% said it's either going to stay the same or increase.
Aha,
So actually,
okay,
45% said it's going to increase, and 45% said it's going to stay the same. So only 10% said that what's going on economically, global perspective, is going to negatively impact their cloud spend. So to your point, the really interesting takeaway that I had from this is, like you said, is that when it comes time to tighten the belt, cloud's not the first thing by any means, right? We're going to look other places because we realize, again, this is such a great avenue for innovation, and an avenue to reach new markets, and an avenue to experiment, and an avenue to get out of what's not our core competency, right? And from my own past, I helped manage a data center because we had to, right? I was a developer, but I helped manage a data center because we needed it. I didn't like, no offense to data center managers, I didn't like doing that. I did it because I had to, right? So now all of a sudden I get to the point where I can focus just on what I want to do and let someone else manage that. By all means, sign me up.
Well, it's so relevant, and that it ties into our earlier point in the cloud spend is a concern. So even as companies say, hey, we're concerned about cloud spend, at the same time, they're saying, you know what, but we're not actually going to put that item on the chopping block first. So it's sort of a testament to the importance and the power on cloud.
Absolutely. And it ties in sort of another point that we saw in the report is the rise of FinOps. And we can talk a little bit about that as well, is that I think 72%, we asked folks, how many of you out there have a dedicated FinOps team, a financial operations or a cloud financial management team, if you will? 72% said they had such a team, which I thought was very high. I was happy to see that, a very high number. And to your point, we're not going to be not spend money on cloud, but we're going to try to be more efficient, right? We're not going to cut the budget here, right? We're going to cut the budget elsewhere. We're going to do the belt tightening elsewhere. But we do realize, and another number in the report is we ask every year, what is your self-estimated wasted spend? How much does your gut tell you on the cloud that you're wasting? And it's usually right around 30%. This year, I think it was 28% this year.
Pretty high then, really.
But it's pretty high, exactly. And always, it's usually right around 28 to 33% every year. And so I think folks realize, yeah, I'm not doing this efficiently, right? And I want to get better at this. And therefore, this FinOps discipline, this FinOps practice is becoming more and more prevalent and more common in these organizations.
All right, we talked about this point earlier. We talked about the AWS and Azure continue to battle for the lead in overall cloud adoption. I think it's interesting that SMBs are focused more on AWS. Enterprise, of course, naturally would be Azure. Some of the other players in, I mean, we know the names, but any way to comment on some of the other players we know and love that are either also rans or maybe they're coming up in the horse race?
Yeah, and what we're seeing, and we ask this every year, we ask, what are you using in production? What are you experimenting with? And what are you planning to use? You're not using, but it's on your roadmap kind of thing. And what we're seeing is that Google, GCP, and OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, are the two most highly experimented this year, and were last year as well. And what we've seen historically is, we kind of talked at the beginning, is that experimentation either leads to adoption or it drops off entirely if it doesn't work, right? So for example, Kubernetes and containers back in the day, lots of experimentation. Now it's all in production, right? That became a thing. OpenStack back in the day was a lot of experimentation, and it's pretty much dropped off, right? So it either happens or it doesn't happen.
Right.
And so we'll see in the next year or two if Google and OCI cross that threshold into actual production use, or if they drop off the map, if you will. Google has been slowly, steadily increasing. Now, granted, it is still third by I don't have the number in front of me, but
they're a distant third, if I remember.
There you go, distant third. Good way to put it. And then we're starting to see OCI gain a little bit of traction there as well, particularly because they've really been doing a great job of regional expansion. They have stuff pretty much everywhere at this point. So that's attractive to many of their customers. And also, if you're an Exadata customer and you want to run Exadata in the cloud, using the old Henry Ford thing again, you have one option, right? You can use Oracle. So they have a niche market there as well.
And this is probably off the topic of the report. I just wonder if you have any comment on it. Like some of the, Google has been in the running really since the early days, and for whatever reason, it has remained a distant third. This is just your own common sense, or your personal view. Do you have a sense of why that would be so? Why Google's remained a distant third?
Yeah, and this is going to be very much just my personal opinion.
Right, I understand.
Just so you know.
Not the report, just Brian's opinion.
Brian's opinion, and also based on an interaction that I had, probably this would have been 2014, 2015, so many years ago. So what I've seen, I've been in the room with Azure salespeople. I've been in the room with AWS salespeople, and they know how to sell to the enterprise, right? Azure, Microsoft, absolutely, and AWS has been getting better year over year. They know the right buttons to push, they know the right keywords to say, they know the right carrots to dangle, whatever the right phrase would be. And I think Google has struggled there a little bit. I still remember being this 2014, 2015 era where I was in the room with a couple of Google sales guys, and they had on the plaid shirt and Birkenstocks with their feet up on the desk talking, and they called the CFO dude, and no offense, that's great, but that's not presenting that professional, I really got my handle on this kind of thing.
Right.
So I think, now I know that's changed a lot. It's been almost 10 years at this point, but I think that they were a little behind in the how to sell into the enterprise. And therefore, a lot of their adoption has been amongst the developer community, which is wonderful, but they're not the ones who have the dollars.
Right, right. I want to look at the future, but before we get to the future as suggested by the report, is there another point or so that's worth mentioning in terms of stats and trend lines?
The other thing that I thought is interesting, and we're seeing it year over year as well, is that the adoption of tools, now be those like cloud configuration tools, how I'm going to go ahead and configure my resources, and container management tools. We're starting to see less and less use of the agnostic tools, the Terraforms and Ansibles and Chefs and Puppets of the world. And folks, again, and this probably is a result of folks focusing more, like we talked about earlier, on a single public cloud provider. They're starting to use those native tools, right? A CloudFormation template in AWS does everything. AWS comes out with a new service tomorrow. I can use a CFT to do that. I can't do that in Terraform. I've either got to write my own or leverage a community or something like that. So this agnostic view is a great, aspiration, if you will, but it can lead to a lot of extra development time and resources that are required. So we're seeing more and more folks gravitate towards the provider purpose-built tools for cloud configuration and also for like Kubernetes management, like the EKSs and the AKSs in Azure and the GKEs in Google and stuff like that. So that was another interesting takeaway. We're definitely seeing the agnostic tools decrease in use and the provider tools increase in use.
I've always wondered about that particular competition because there are a lot of companies, even beyond that sector, that offer tools that the cloud providers themselves offer. And it seems like in many cases, or in some cases, their selling point is, sure, the hyperscalers offer it, but this is the only thing we do, so our tool is better. And you could make that argument. It seems like it's a tough hill to try to climb because if AWS has it, then why are you going to, hire a third party to do it? But the answer could be we're better. I don't know. Does that suggest a future? I'm edging to our future question. Does that suggest a future where the hyperscalers have more and more market share of the various tools they offer?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, some of these third-party tools may be superior in some ways, but the ease of use, right? The ease of use is so important. It's what I call operational burden when I talk to folks, right? I don't have to do the care and feeding of this thing anymore. Yeah, your tool is more powerful, but man, I got to manage the infrastructure and the storage and the backups and the patching, and all this stuff takes time and resources that my guys could be focused on something else.
Right.
And you're getting like AWS and they have Fargate. Well, that's serverless at this point. I don't even need to manage the infrastructure. Well, shoot, that became even easier. So it's really hard. It is a tough hill to climb when you're saying, yes, my tool is more powerful, but the care and feeding of it is significantly more than using these provider tools.
Mm-hmm. And the big sector I think that plays in is the idea of artificial intelligence, and that the hyperscalers sell all sorts of AI services. And of course, there are other independent companies that sell AI services and even have AI platforms. And I think it's, the $64 billion question is, who's going to get more of the AI sector going forward? Will it be the hyperscalers, or will it be some of those standalone players that are actually very talented? Care to offer a wild opinion? Again, I know that'd be just your opinion. It's not in the report, but
Yeah. Well, I think if history has shown us anything, right, these tools are going to be experimented with quite a bit, and then they're either going to find their way into production or they're going to fall off. And historically, like I said, the tools around configuration management and container management have gone through that same cycle, but folks have gravitated towards the provider tools because they integrate with everything and they're super easy to use. So AI is a great one. In the report, again, we do the currently using, experimenting, plan to use. Experimenting AI and ML is the highest experimenting that we're seeing right now. So
really
we'll have this discussion next year or 2 years from now. We'll really have a good feel on where this is headed. Yeah.
fascinating. All right, well, let's look to the future. I'm wondering if you could, put all the tea leaves together. You've seen the report over a number of years. You've seen this year's report. You're right. You're very close to it. Is there a trend line or something? Can we see the future of cloud based on what some of the evolving trend lines you've noticed are? Where are we going with cloud?
Yeah, and I think we touched on it a little bit. Sort of some of this might be a bit of a repeat, but like I said, the report over the years has also shown us the things that didn't pan out, like the OpenStacks of the world.
Right.
Serverless is another great example. Not that it didn't pan out, but it had this great promise, right? We saw huge experimentation when AWS Lambda first came out, and then Azure Function and Google Functions. Lots of folks were experimenting with it, and those that had use cases that aligned with it, yeah, it was a no-brainer. But not everybody had a use case that aligned with it, or they had to do significant refactoring of their code base in order to take advantage. So they experimented with it and went, I'm not ready for, or this isn't for me. This is a cool thing, but this cool thing is not for me. And as such, we didn't really see the adoption. So I think what we're seeing is that we've seen a couple of those fall off. We'll see, with the AI ML toolkits, for example, we'll see where that goes in the next few years. But as far as the trends, I really think that AWS and Azure continue to be at the top and continue to battle it out. We're seeing the adoption on the SMB side even more so towards AWS. So there's going to be that delineation or whatever it is between enterprises gravitating towards Azure and the SMBs more towards AWS. I think we'll just see that expand even more. The movement toward a single public cloud, I think that's interesting, and I think it's very much related to what we talked about the use of the tools. Again, they make it so easy, right? Why wouldn't I use this thing that gives me an extra 5 or 10 hours a week to work on other stuff? So I think we're going to see more of that movement towards a single public cloud because folks are differentiating on services and not on the least common denominator stuff like we talked about. And then the other big thing is the rise of FinOps. We're really seeing a huge rise there. Flexera is a member, I should mention, of the FinOps Foundation, so we kind of have a little bit of a behind the scenes, but
Mhm.
There's over, I think, 9,000 members in the FinOps Foundation now, over 3,300 certified practitioners. It's the framework and the discipline is gaining a lot of traction out there, and a lot of folks are getting that what's the word, the verbiage and the words they use, right, the terminology in their head, and so a lot of folks are leveraging that in their processes, in their products, and how they do things in regards to cloud financial management. So I think we're going to continue to see that rise of FinOps, even if folks don't necessarily call it a FinOps group. We're still going to see that rise of
Mhm.
that discipline in a lot of these organizations.
One point I want to make sure I understand from what you just said, you talk about serverless. I thought serverless had gained pretty much adoption. You're saying it was an experimental phase, and it's a sports car that doesn't get used all that much. Like,
That's a great that's a great example. I mean, it's definitely used in production, right? We definitely see it, but it's in very specific use cases. Like I'll give
okay,
a brief and quick example. Back in the RightScale days, I used to help folks, as a solutions architect. We had one client who came along and they did some sort of, you take a photo with your camera, you upload it, they apply some filters and they post it on your social media. Well, they had a bunch of infrastructure running at 4 a.m. when no one's using their camera, but just in case someone used their camera, they had to have this stuff running. And it was idle 90% of the time. Well, they said, okay, let's go ahead and go to serverless, right? And all that happens is that when someone actually uploads a photo, we wake up, do our thing, and go back to sleep. They saw a 90% cost reduction in their AWS costs by using it. But they were the poster child for
right,
serverless.
right.
Not everybody has that use case, right? So if you can find that use case, absolutely makes sense. A lot of folks were trying to, what's the square peg round hole, right? They were trying to
Right,
find a way
right.
to make it fit, and it wasn't really fitting. Or like I said, they realized, I could take advantage of this thing, but man, I got to refactor all my code so that it fits in a Lambda function, and I don't have the time or resources to do that right now.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm. Interesting.
serverless is wonderful and great, but you have to have the right fit for it, and not everybody does.
Good to know. Good to know. Brian, I think you said it. I learned a ton. I like to think that I keep up with cloud, but these conversations, I always learn so much. I think I've gotten a refresher course on where we are with cloud. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your insight. And please come back and talk with us again.
I will be glad to be back, and thank you very much for the invite. Appreciate it.